It's great to meet you, Amadou.
Likewise. How are
Yeah,
you?
I'm good. I'm good. I'm so excited to talk to you. We One thing we talked about a lot at our panel on Saturday was obviously the West African origins of the banjo, and so I know you're an expert practitioner of West African music, and so it's really exciting to get to talk to you about this. And so I guess if you could start by telling us a little bit about yourself and what you do and how that relates to West African music, and we'd
Okay.
be yeah.
Well, my name is Amadou Kouyate. I'm a musician and a instructor, a lecturer, a professor. But I come from a lineage of oral historians from the Manding culture of West Africa.
Hmm.
And these oral historians are known as Djali. And in the process of them, fulfilling their duty to the community, they play music as a means for disseminating information, and the progenitor of the banjo is an instrument's part of the orchestra.
Hmm. So you mentioned Jelly and Storyteller. Is that similar to griot? Is that a related term, or is that a different thing?
Well, they're often associated with one another, but
Mm-hmm.
uh, the term griot comes from, it's a French origin, and it comes from the mispronunciation of a Wolof word, gewel.
Hmm.
So gewel are the oral historians, similar to the Jelly of the Wolof ethnic group in Senegal.
Okay.
So when the French came to uh, interact with the gewel and of the Wolof people, and they saw someone who's there who is communicating, and they have everyone's attention, and the oratory skills and the theatrics that are involved. The assumption is that, okay, if everyone's paying attention, this person must be telling a story.
Hmm.
It's just contextualizing based on familiarity. So they ask, who's this person, and they say Gewel, but obviously the French don't speak Wolof, so Gewel becomes griot, and because of the colonial presence of the French in Senegal and West Africa, the association stuck. So
Hmm.
griot now means storyteller.
As people who, as Americans, it might be kind of difficult for us to understand like what it means, what music means in West African culture versus like what music is in maybe like more of a American or European tradition. Because I think we separate the two, right? And in American culture, we have like separate music, right?
Yeah.
You're a musician, but you're not really like necessarily a storyteller, or you're not a dancer, like you're a musician.
Mm.
So is that different in West African culture? Is there more of an overlap, like less defined
Well, I
lines.
think that there's a bit of compartmentalization that happens in that respect in just Western culture,
Yeah.
in a way where certain aspects of the arts, like the necessity to articulate the human experience, is kind of relegated to entertainment.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it has there's a tendency to taking the folk out of folk music, like the folk out of folk dance. So there ends up being these delineations where now there this separation, even though there's music and there's art and there's culture that stems from it, the function from which that culture originates is disjuncted in a way.
Hmm.
I think obviously that's my opinion, but I think that in West African cultures, I mean, really a lot of cultures around the world, but to be specific in Manding culture, um, there's this notion that everything we do there is intricately connected to the life process.
Hmm.
So if music isn't created arbitrarily, thus the musician doesn't exist in isolation of a role and responsibility to the community they serve. Like
Yeah.
the dancer doesn't exist arbitrarily, so they don't exist arbitrarily.
Yeah.
So as music is being created, like for example for the Djali, you know, we're creating not just music to accompany the social circumstance, but there's also music created to educate the community of the past to also be able to uh, serve a particular role and responsibility and being this intermediary between knowledge and how people are living their life, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
Because the same person who would be the storyteller, according to how we define it, like the Djali or how the griot, is the same person who also is in negotiation, between families and marriage, is the emissary for, the royal court, is the council, in the Congress of the people, how it works. So you have all of these roles functioning, you know, concentrically with this one term. So
Hmm.
when I say jelly, as opposed to simply saying griot, like griot, in a sense, it's just one function of the Djelia, which is the
Okay.
culture of the jelly. You
Understood.
know,
Yeah.
so I
Yeah.
mean, we do share similarities in the sense that anywhere you go, people are, they're creating music to articulate their experience, right?
Hmm.
So there's this idea of holding on to tradition and holding on to information and weaving it into music so that the story isn't lost, right?
Yeah.
But I think where things differ at this point is that where in the Manding culture of West Africa, where the role of the responsibility of the jelly is widely accepted as a necessary part of a community. I think that in the larger, American landscape, for example, like I feel like some of the folk artists or people who do study these traditions are kind of pushed into a niche that um, they end up creating these subgroups that don't necessarily always function in the larger community the way they would have 100 years ago.
Right. Right.
You know,
Yeah.
so it almost ends up being uh, I don't want to say nostalgic because it's a living, breathing culture.
Right.
As we know, folk music is constantly developing. Just like back home in the jelly culture with the ngoni and the kora and
Mhm.
all of the instruments that are part of the orchestra. They're constantly developing because the culture is still alive.
Yeah. Yeah. tradition, like they often become maybe like a historical thing. They put it in a box of
Hmm.
something that happened in the past, and it's not something that is currently developing or changing. Yeah, and I agree with you that that is, I think, problematic. Maybe we could talk about the instruments that you play. I know you play the Kora. I would love to see it. I know it's this has a ton of strings on it, right?
Yeah, I have a chord next to me. I figured you might want to.
Yeah.
Um,
You know what we want.
this is one of the chords.
Oh, so cool.
Well, my family and I, we build them. My children help me build them and
Oh,
everything.
wow. Yeah.
One that my daughters help me build.
That's
Uh,
amazing.
it's one of the more traditional styles that we do, where obviously, well, not obviously, but the core is made from a gourd,
Hmm.
calabash that's covered with cow skin.
Yeah.
There's a staff that runs through it, and the rings that you see here are also made out of cow skin. Like my other cores, I use machine tuners because of the convenience, but when I'm teaching my children or we're learning just in the intergenerational transmission, I make sure that we keep the traditional system.
Are those like frets? Do those tell you where to put your fingers?
No, they're fretless, but the rings on the staff, we push them up and down to
Mm-hmm.
increase or decrease the tension on the string to give it,
Oh.
like so. A little bit out of tune.
Oh, so it's like a harp. Every string is an individual pitch. You don't actually stop the string with your finger.
Yeah, it's
Oh.
fretless. Most chords you see are gonna have 21. Sometimes people will have an adaptation with 22, and then you have a more traditional yang style which has 26.
Hmm.
But 21 is pretty much the standard.
How long does it take you to build one of those?
To build,
Uh
if
huh.
I'm working straight through, and none of the materials are like been prepped, like if I just have like there's a tree over there and there's a cow over there. I mean, it could take maybe a week or two, but when I'm building, I try to be, depending on what kind of core I'm building, it varies. So if I'm making a traditional core like this, there's a lot of factors to consider, making sure it's made properly.
Mhm.
If I'm making one like the core that I normally play for like my Sunday core meditations or with my band, then I use the machine tuners, just put in a pickup and a preamp and just plug and play.
Just adapting it to current practice. Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
you got to. I mean,
Yeah,
it's a different environment essentially. Like
yeah,
at home, even just you know, environmentally, like you have two seasons. It's rainy season and it's dry season. It's either gonna be hot or it's either gonna be wet. Like,
yeah.
but here it's like, here in Baltimore, it was 30 degrees this morning and you know,
Yeah,
right now it's like almost 70, so it's just the dynamics have created a need for just adaptation and just influence too, because I
yeah,
can plug into the pedal board and start shredding or
yeah.
you know
Yeah.
however.
So to me, as someone who knows nothing about choras and frankly not that much about West African music, to me, I mean, the construction of the kora looks similar to the construction of the banjo, and this is like jumping to a huge conclusion. So it definitely could stand some critique, right? But there is, to me, some similarities with that. You have the calabash, like you mentioned, and then you have it looks like a skin or plastic um, with tension
Hmm.
across it. Is that how it's built?
Yeah, and I'd be remiss if I didn't say that just the Ngoni, particularly being a progenitor of the banjo, is in the same family. It's grandfather to a kora essentially. Like
Mm-hmm.
the kora is one of the younger instruments in this orchestra, even though it's ancient. But when we're talking about instruments such as the banjo and the ngoni, like not only talking about just being like just timeless essentially. I mean not timeless, but they've been around for so long. But in a particular case of American culture, like the same people who are inventing it in Africa, even displaced by slavery and displaced by the circumstances around that, like they're still the same people. You
Mm-hmm.
take your cultural technology wherever you go. So it's like the different parts of the world where they create instruments that way, and in the development of any instrument is a part of a cultural technology.
Yeah.
So, you might not, so the ngoni, the kind of wood that they use in building it, it's called gano. It's the same kind of wood that they use for
Mm.
the staff of the kora. Like it doesn't grow here, but they make the gourds grow here, and the different materials. I like to think of the adaptations similar to how people uh, do with food. Like, let's say it's a dish that you grew up eating, um, and there's legacy in it. You learn it. In your home, your appetite, your taste has been established as this is a part of who you are, and then you go to another part of the world. You're going to try your best to create that dish, but there will be variables based on what's available.
Right. Yeah, that's we talked about that a bit in the panel about people look to West Africa and they see instruments that look like that and they're like, "Oh, that's got to be a connection." And it is true, but like you said, it's not the only place in the world where there are instruments with a skin or a vibrating body, that's built like that. So it's
The
not exclusive to.
resonator with the gourd with the in the
Mhm.
skin. Like it's ancient technology, but it
Yeah.
is African technology that's been
Yeah.
around, millennia. So when I think that a lot of times in the same vein of that compartmentalizing that we talked about a little bit earlier,
Mm-hmm.
like that same thing happens when it comes to making the connections between people and as societies, the things that we hold on to and let go, especially as it pertains to music and the instrumentation. So it's like obviously at some point in human development, you know, this it proved to be an effective means of carrying the sound and resonating and amplifying the instrument. So even though that existed on the continent, the certain adaptations that have maintained here. Like if it wasn't functional, people wouldn't have done it here.
Right. And if it wasn't practical too, right? I mean,
Mhm.
it's you can build it out of widely, well, available materials that you would have access to, like you were
True.
saying. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Um, One other thing people talk about when they try to find this, the West African connection to the banjo, in current practice, that they talk about the technique of playing the banjo. Um, and one thing we mentioned, or somebody on the panel mentioned, was the clawhammer style. And I don't know if you know much
Yeah.
about it, but yeah, it's a downstroke technique where you're taking your fingers and you're
Hmm.
attacking downward. And one of the panelists had said something about um, not knowing of any European techniques that are like that. Typically, for a lute or something or a guitar, it's an up picking
Hmm.
style. And I know this is probably a super leading question and probably not super easy to answer, but like the way you play your instruments is. Do you think that there is that connection with the downstroke technique, and that's like super specific, so it's okay.
I think there are certain instruments, Gorded, like lutes and like the halam, for example, that they play. The konting, which is in Senegambia as well,
Hmm.
where I've seen the downstroke. Um, Obviously, the chord is a little different because we're actually plucking towards our body with our
Right,
index fingers and pushing away
right.
the thumb. So it's like, you know, it's different. But I think a lot of the technical adaptations come from its correlation to how language and nuance is communicated through an instrument, right? So when we're talking,
Really, I'd love to hear more about that. Yeah.
so a lot of the music is created uh, with language and the imitation of the voice to an extent.
Hmm.
Like even the vocal of the chorus, the instrument literally exists uh, to uh, to recount this spiritual encounter that Djali had with spirit, and the chorus supposed to be an emulation of that voice.
Hmm.
But I guess more practically, the way that people speak, Bamana, the way that the languages are going to vary inside of the different regions of the Mali Empire. So we're talking Senegal, Mali, Guinea, Sierra Leone, Ivory Coast, Northern Mauritania, the Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, Liberia. Like we're talking about a large area,
Yeah.
and there's certain idiosyncrasies that happen linguistically that are adapted to or mimicked in how people play the instrument. You know, Even the tuning systems that we use, like their variants, like there's certain songs that you can only play in one of the four traditional tuning systems because linguistically there has to be certain approaches. You know,
Wow.
Even more so, how we use the pentatonics and stuff for like some of the music. Like if we go northeast, we start to go into Mali and places like that.
Man,
Um,
and that's something that I know as scholars, and you probably run into this too, where people are formalizing music research and scholarship. I think that really gets forgotten a lot, is the connection between language and music.
mhm. I mean, I think it's just I am. I know this is one thing that I've experienced, especially you get around the musicology or just being in the field of scholar so much that I think we kind of go around Robin Hood's barn with how like innovation is reflective of creativity and necessity, right? So the one of the factors that's consistent in how people are communicating is language. You know, like new words are incorporated into a lexicon, new sounds, new things. People interact with one another. All of these things are affecting how people play. And when I listen to blues music, you know, well, not even just blues. Like I can think of anything. Like I know that me growing up in the states, in African American culture, like there's a way that the organ sings in church. There's a way that when people play the slide, and not just the African American culture. Like look at somebody like Derek Trucks, like he has a voicing in his guitar playing. That's a it's a voicing. And I think that in order to be able to articulate that, there's certain things that have to be consistent. Like you might use a slide because a slide can effectively create that sensation. I think the same thing applies for the banjo or particularly the kora. Like there's certain dynamics that can only be created by changing your technique because we're trying to imitate the language. Essentially, that frequency evokes a certain sentiment that like that's the only way you get to it.
Right.
So I mean, yes, it technically, people, they quantify or qualify these different places, but if you don't connect it to the people themselves, then it's really hard. It's always going to seem magical, like it just comes out of nowhere.
Right.
Like so, like if you're listening to the Piedmont blues and you're hearing how they're running through the guitar, like for me, somebody who's a practitioner of the Kora, the technique in that they use, even in the claw hammer, it sounds very similar to what in Kora what we know is the kambang, which is like this way that we self accompany, you know, our playing. For example,
Yeah,
uh,
please, please.
one popular song that I'm Kora, not I mean popular, but this is literally the first thing we learn. We're learning Kora traditionally. Uh, like Caliphate is one of the songs that we learn. But that whole self-accompanying syncopation that you, well, but that whole idea of like that self-accompaniment, like that whole process is very similar. If I were to take the instrument away from here and change it into this idea that even as I'm playing a song, the self accompaniment frees up so that the things that are not a part of that foundational music that are communicated are directly attached to language. So certain phrasing then, is associated to not just people, place, and things, but like, there are a lot of indicators in it. Like you can listen to somebody's licks and be like, okay, they learned from this region and this house and this person, like, and that's transferable in a lot of the folk traditions. Like I'm sure there's certain banjo players that have or certain places where they play where there's such a particular style, you can, as soon as you hear a certain, self accompaniment or process, you're like, oh, I know that they studied this way. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. To me, what you're talking about is it's like you're setting the stage with an accompaniment, right? With how you're playing it, you're setting up a framework or something that you can use to communicate, right? And to me, like the clawhammer technique is kind of like that too. You're It's like a consistent, dun 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 dun, it kind of pulsing
Hmm.
sound, and I can definitely see the connection there, and I can see the connection to something like the blues too, where you have, as someone who thinks of like a really classical way, like I think of it as like a chord progression that
Hmm.
is consistent. But really what it is, I think, is that same kind of framework, right? It's like you have this repeating pattern that that you can use to kind of support the communication, what you're
Yeah.
trying to communicate. Yeah.
And for me, like it's such an inherently African concept. Like,
Yeah, yeah.
just it allows some room for that call and response, that dialogue, like that. And what people don't realize too is that process of engaging in this repetition in this kind of way, it's not just singing the same thing or playing the same thing, but what it is really aligning people's energy to the same concepts
Right.
and endeavors. Like, when people are having to build a railroad and they create these songs, so laying line and stuff, they're working together. And working together, you got to be on the same accord in order to be able to do it. Very similarly to like some music's created for grand societies when people are farming. When people are farming traditionally, we have to be moving in the same accord in order to complete this endeavor. So this idea that we're going to take, these cycling patterns and we're going to really create and manufacture a mood, a sensation, so that people can feel and be connected. Like connectivity is really important, especially when you're talking about cultures where you have to be accountable for your energy in the space. You got to be accountable for how you show up, and not just what you think and what you do, but what you're feeling, how you're connecting.
Yeah.
So I always liked that when you're when you use that awareness and interacting with different spaces, because like um and musicians do it, like sometimes we don't always put a finger on it, but like when you get up and you play with somebody or you guys jam or you come together, we're immediately searching for a point of connectivity. Like we don't have to sit there and be able to like, scientifically boom, 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 boom. Like, you immediately become sensitive to the fact there has to be a connection in order for this thing to happen. And
Right.
I
Yeah.
think that that's the premise that it all is built from. That obviously it's not so abstract. There's a science to it. Like that's why they invented tuning systems. That's
Yeah.
where They invent. That's why the scholarship involved traditionally. Like you have to study and apprentice and learn and know the what is this medicine doing essentially.
Yeah,
So but that's universal. Is I
definitely.
it's the reason why like I remember years ago, and on occasion I still work with uh, a few banjo players, but in particular a couple years ago I was artist in residence at Strathmore, and
Hmm.
I happened to be in the same year with a young man named Brad Clodner, and we he played banjo, and we ended up collaborating on a couple things, and just the transference wasn't really. It didn't take much. It just take being able to listen to one another, and then the music kind of falls into itself. Now, I mean, now obviously it takes you have to take attention to it, but just the idea that like foundationally, there's enough correlation that we don't have to like it's not oil and water. We just have to be sensitive to one another. You know.
Yeah, I think the reason that maybe works well with West African music and American music is because of where American music comes from, right? I mean,
Mhm.
we wouldn't have American music if it weren't for West African music.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Mhm. I, I I think that it is an essential part of the narrative that sometimes is left out of the conversations, or just kind of addressed in a really like safe and that in an abstract way. But like no, like it's not foreign because it's not foreign. Like so I recognize that when I'm listening to somebody and they're playing a particular song. I mean, not that everything is, one plus one equals two, because people are creative and they innovate. But like foundationally, we're able to come to a point of convergence where, like, yes, the information is going to be similar because it comes from the same sources.
yeah,
It's just my vantage point is coming from a source of origin, and in a lot of ways, the vantage point is coming from a source of adaptation through the journey it's come. So I don't negate that. It always shows up. I
yeah,
think the challenge now is that as people begin to want to learn, or have more interest in, you know, the Kora, or even more interest in the banjo or the bluegrass cultures or all the different places where you find banjo predominantly now, being interested in learning the journey between the two. You know.
yeah, yeah. Especially with the social baggage, the racial cultural baggage that comes with the banjo. It's we talked about it a little bit on Saturday too, where it's sort of a nowadays a stereotypical white instrument. Someone had mentioned some things they'd come up against when they were giving tours of the Appomattox area,
Hmm.
and he would talk about the banjo because that was his interest, and he cited one example where he said, "Well, the banjo's from Africa," and one of the people on the tour got really upset and stormed out. So it's like it has this like it can be difficult to talk about, but I think you're absolutely right. Like it is something that needs to be talked about because it's the truth.
Well, I agree. I mean, I don't. For me, it's not difficult because,
Yeah.
like, I don't know. I'm very abreast of even in my time. It's not an ancient thing. It's not an old thing to. It, American culture has a very legacy history in the seizure of black intellectual property. Like it's just like that happened.
Yeah.
So it's like for the energy that goes into like universal making things I don't want to say fit for mass consumption, but like commodified in American society, especially coming out of the black experience in America. We know that some of the origin and some of the history about it gets stripped away. It's this idea that these types of intelligence can exist in comfort in American society and be attached to black faces.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So especially when we come to, I know in my experiences dealing with, you know, folk music here, and this idea that it comes from Africa being an accepted, uh, you know, no, it's a consensus truth. People are like, yes, this comes from Africa, right?
Hmm.
But the idea that it doesn't just come from Africa because African people just freely give this, we didn't come to America and say let's jam. Like
Right,
there's a,
right,
there's a
right.
history around the negotiation of art and music living next to the dynamics that have persisted and continue to persist in this country. So it can be an easy conversation when discussing the history and reality and the journey of this country becomes an easy conversation. I think it's only difficult because even in society today, we're still struggling with that.
Yeah.
So I'm all for it. I never really step back from it, but I don't always step into it because people a lot of times are very protective of their experiences, not necessarily. It doesn't need to be grounded in truth or reality. Like it's just like perception, right? So you got people coming together and they could be playing music that me coming from a tradition, listening to the music, like the only thing different is the words here. Like you're literally playing a traditional song that is just adapted,
Yeah.
But in that, to speak about the foundation of the musical legacy that I would be referring to in this kind of music, and people have a difficult time, accepting that they can be African and still be, this creative or syncopated or intricate or complex, because anybody knows like it ain't easy to play a banjo. It takes time. It takes sophistication. You know what I'm saying? You have to study it. There's scholarship involved, which means that when you study African culture, the culture, it's complex.
Hmm.
It's sophisticated. You have to study. You know what I'm saying? The sophistication of all. Like, the only disconnect that I find is in the fact that, the practice has been in order to be assimilated into the larger dominant cultures here, a lot of times black expressions have to be minimized.
Yeah.
You know,
I mean, you can see that with the study of jazz, I think, right? I mean, you
or
can see
blues
it
or hip hop or rock and roll. Or,
exactly.
you know what I'm saying? Like it is a practice, you know what I'm saying? But then like I said before, so is the seizure of black intellectual property in
Hmm.
America particularly. It is very different in America.
Yeah.
Because the effort to not have the conversation is often just as vehemently like protected.
Yeah. Yeah.
So but
Yeah.
I think by not having it, it also negates the creativity and innovation and contributions of everybody along the way.
Yeah.
Right?
I agree with you. Yeah, absolutely. Well, one last question for you, and thank you for indulging us. I know we had some big questions, but if you could tell us a little about, and we kind of touched on it a little bit, but why do you do the work that you do, and why is it important to you?
It's a responsibility. Like it's not about me.
Mm.
It's about my family. My family has been doing it for 150 generations. Like, and my children are the 151st.
Wow.
And I have no plans on dropping the ball. I'm not gonna have my ancestors mad at me. you know?
That's a good reason. Yeah.
Yeah, my father was a traditionalist. My mother, was definitely a traditionalist too. Like two different worlds. My father coming from Senegal and West Africa. My mother, growing up in D.C. with a family from the Carolinas, shared very similar values around culture and tradition. It's
Hmm.
why I'm here. Like, if they didn't share those values, I wouldn't be here.
Yeah.
And one value that they shared is the idea of the notion that your responsibility to your family's history is very important.
Mm.
So I can't get out of that. I
Yeah.
mean, do I want to do other things? Of course. Growing up, I'm like, I'm gonna play basketball. They were like,
Yeah.
"Yeah, we're gonna practice sport first." You know,
Yeah.
so I mean, I accept it because it's just one of those journeys that, as it came full circle, as I really sought find my own identity in it. I realized a lot of my identity was already in the foundation that I had,
Mm.
you know, and that my responsibility as a Djali in the United States in 2021, is one that is just as important as it would have been in the 13th century in West Africa.
Yeah.
It's just this is my village. Like the role doesn't change.
Yeah.
That's why I do it.
Thank you so much, Amadou. It was so great to talk to you. I learned so much from this conversation. So thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the work you're doing. And thank you to the Arts Council, everybody involved. Thank you, Monique.